Hi, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially subscribing to the video. And be sure to hit the bell notification when you do so that you always get notified whenever I have a new video out, whether it's Mysterious World or something else. These days, I usually have several videos out a week. Hope you enjoy this.
Thanks for joining us today, Jimmy. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. How are you two?
Doing all right. It's great to have you. So you have a pretty decently sized podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm actually on like five different podcasts a week, but the most famous one is Jimmy Akins' Mysterious World. And it's a podcast that looks at mysterious topics of all different kinds from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. So sometimes we look at religious mysteries, sometimes we look at scientific mysteries, sometimes we look at historical mysteries, true crime, paranormal mysteries, UFOs, psychic phenomena, all kinds of different things. And unlike a lot of mystery-based shows, we don't just try to generate wonder, just imagine what if on the part of the audience. We actually try to solve the mysteries to the extent that that's possible. And so we make lists of explanations, what could explain this phenomena we're talking about, starting with natural explanations, and then we go through them and see which explanations are and are not promising. Oh, and I should say, since you mentioned it being a larger one, it's regularly in the top 20 documentary podcasts on Apple Podcasts in the U.S., and we estimate we have more than 100,000 listeners a week.
Amazing.
That's awesome. Well, and one of your recent episodes was on NDEs, and you brought in a lot of really cool information about that, and that's part of what we're going to kind of focus in on today. What are NDEs?
Yeah, so NDEs are something we've covered more than once on the show. We did an early episode. It was like episode 27 or something. But more recently, in episode 292, we did an episode on disturbing NDEs. And basically, a near-death experience, or NDE, is an event. It's a type of experience that is reported in life-threatening situations, including situations where people have suffered cardiac arrest, so their heart is not beating. Now, that's not true of all NDEs. Some NDEs occur when a person is merely endangered, but they go all the way up to clinical death. And these began to be popularly known in the 1970s. They've been reported all the way down through history, but it wasn't really until 1975 when a philosopher and later psychologist named Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life that they became popularly known. They involve a common set of sub-experiences, which include things like an out-of-body experience where the NDE experiencer will look down on their body and see, for example, doctors and medical technicians trying to revive them. It includes an experience frequently of moving through a dark tunnel towards a light, emerging into light, being greeted by various figures, including deceased relatives, and also religious figures. It frequently includes receiving what's called a life review, which is essentially the person experiencing everything they did in their life, all in a flash, frequently from the perspective of other people. So they get to see how their actions impacted others for good or for bad. People often see a beautiful realm, sometimes described as, garden-like or with fountains and happy people and so forth. They may hear beautiful music. And at some point, and not all of these experiences happen in every NDE, but these are the common ones. They often report reaching a point where they're either told you have to go back now, or they're given a choice. Do you want to go back now? And they'll be told that a particular barrier like maybe a stream or something like that. If you cross this, you're going to stay. You're not going to be able to go back. So they reach a kind of point of no return, and either they're told it's not your time, you're going to go back, or they're given an option. Do you want to stay or do you want to go? And then, since these are reports we have, all of the people who've reported them have ended up coming back one way or another, either because they were sent or because they chose to come back. And then they report on this after they have come back from the near-death experience. So that's kind of the way you hear near-death experiences commonly reported. Those are the common elements. In terms of the emotional tone of these, you hear lots and lots of reports of these being very positive, that people experience joy and happiness and tranquility and bliss, and it's just a really wonderful experience. And that kind of emotional tone has been widely reported in the press and widely reported in near-death research as well. And that, when near-death experiences started to be reported, left some Christians wondering, well, okay, where's hell in all this? Because heaven is, one destiny we have that we can go to, but there's also hell. Why don't we ever hear reports of hellish near-death experiences? And, of course, one reason for that could be the people who go to hell don't get to come back. And so it's a reporting artifact. We only the good people get an option to come back or get sent back, and so we never hear about the hellish ones. But it turns out there are negative near-death experiences where people have unpleasant experiences on the other side and then come back and talk about them. And in recent years, these themselves have become an object of study. And so that's what I did, episode 292 of Mysterious World on. People can access it by going to mysterious.fm/292, or they can go to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. You do have to spell my name correctly if you want to get there, though. It's JIMMYAKIN. No E's, T's, or S's. As simple as it can be. Akin, AKIN. But that's just one of the mysteries we cover on the show. Like I said, we cover lots of other stuff too, but that is one of our recent episodes.
We'll probably have all these links as well, hopefully in the description, so go down and check that, as long as my memory serves me correctly. Oh, also, Jimmy, I just wanted to point out that I ran and grabbed my Mothman cup just in celebration of this.
Yeah, I see. You've got a coffee mug with multiple representations of Mothman on it. That's cool.
Very appropriate. I also have a Bigfoot one, but I figured this one would be a little bit more appropriate since we're talking about a bit of a darker topic.
Seth is horrible at family engagements. He's just like, guys, Mothman, all the time.
As far as cryptids go, that one's got to be one of the more interesting ones.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so on that topic, though, this is pretty astonishing for someone who might have never heard of near-death experiences before. So just as a general question, say I go into cardiac arrest, what are the odds that I would experience something like that if I get brought back?
In terms, basically about 15%. About 15% of people who come back from cardiac arrest remember having a near-death experience. Why not everybody remembers them is not clear. But obviously, cardiac arrest is a very traumatic experience, and it may interfere, and that or the revival from cardiac arrest may interfere with the ability of a person to transfer their experience into long-term memory. So they may well have had an experience and simply not remembered it. Another reason that's been proposed for why more people don't remember them is the drugs that we put people on either during the revival attempt or shortly after the revival attempt. One of the things that gets done in a lot of medical experiences these days that are, traumatic, is a memory interference drug will be given. For example, Versed is a drug that is specifically intended to inhibit memories from forming. So if they're going to do a medical procedure on you that could be traumatizing to remember after the fact, they will give you Versed or some other memory inhibitor to prevent you from remembering it, so that you won't be traumatized by the experience later on. And I have been told having your heart, shocked is a little bit traumatic. When they shock your heart, they're not actually restarting it, but what the heart shock is meant to do is try to get it back into normal rhythm. And being electrocuted is not necessarily a fun experience. And so my understanding is they may well give Versed or other memory inhibitors to people who are experiencing electrocardial stimulation. I've actually had an experience with Versed myself. The men in my family get cataracts in their eyes prematurely early, and I actually went legally blind for a month because of cataracts. I'd had one in my left eye that I'd had for a long time, and then in the course of a weekend, a cataract formed in my right eye over the central part of my focal point. So I couldn't see hardly anything for a month until I could get in for the first surgery. And when I had the surgery, they gave me Versed for both surgeries on both eyes, and they didn't give me enough because I remember all of them perfectly. So I remember laying there on the table. They've got my head strapped down. They use a sonic probe to smash my current lenses. Then they suck them out. Then they put new lenses in. And it wasn't particularly traumatic for me. It was actually an interesting experience, kind of kaleidoscopic.
Awesome. Well, I think for some people who aren't used to talking about NDEs, they might be coming to this thinking, oh, that's not taken seriously by the sciences. Does mainstream science assume that people are just making up these experiences for attention? Or does it take seriously that, people really are having these experiences, but we might not interpret them as indicative of actually, encountering higher things? We disagree on the interpretation, but we agree scientifically people are having these experiences after death.
Yeah, well, individuals, of course, hoax in every area of life. And so there are individuals who hoax near-death experiences. There was a famous one from a few years ago. I think it was called The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven. And there was a book written about it that was very popular, including in evangelical bookstores. And the kid at the center of it admitted his dad kind of manipulated him into telling this story. And he recanted it. And so that book got yanked. There are other experiences of children who've had NDEs that have written books about it. So don't just assume everyone is like that. But there have been hoaxes. However, I don't know anybody who has seriously studied this issue who thinks they're all hoaxes, because they have too many elements in common, including elements that are reported by people who didn't have a knowledge of NDEs. They didn't know about them. They weren't expecting one. And then they come back and they say, I was out of my body. I was looking down. I went through a tunnel. There was a light. I talked to my dead grandma. And this was before people would report these things, before NDEs were widely known in pop culture. So they couldn't have been picking it up from pop culture. And so I think pretty much everyone who seriously looked into this agrees that there are genuine experiences that are happening. The question is, what is responsible for those experiences? Is it something purely natural? Are these artifacts that are generated by the dying brain? Or is something genuinely supernatural or paranormal happening here? And on that question, you've got different schools. If you're talking to a skeptical materialist who thinks that all consciousness is reducible to brain phenomena, then they're going to say these must be some kind of an artifact of the dying brain. There's something there, it's due to anoxia or the release of certain chemicals as part of the dying process, or something purely natural is causing these experiences. On the other hand, if you're not wedded to the materialist hypothesis and you're open to maybe consciousness is not strictly dependent on the brain, then other people will look at them and say, no, it looks like we've actually got evidence that something genuinely paranormal is happening in these cases. One of the pieces of evidence for that is veridical knowledge. Veridical knowledge is information that goes beyond random chance that an individual did not previously know, but that turns out to be true. And there are multiple instances of NDEs that involve veridical knowledge. In fact, there's a whole book that the International Association for Near-Death Studies has put out about cases. It's like over 100 cases where there's a veridical component. To give just one example, back in the 1970s, there was a migrant worker from Mexico in Washington State. Her name was Maria, and she suffered a cardiac arrest. She was brought into the hospital, at night. She did not see the exterior of the hospital, and they were able to restart her heart. And she had very fragmentary English. She was primarily a Spanish speaker, but she got to talk to one of the workers at the hospital who had some high school Spanish, and she was very animated. And she said, "I was floating outside of my body, and I looked down and I saw the doctors and the nurses working on me, and I saw the paper spilling out of the printout, because this was back in the 70s, back when they had those clunky printers back then that everything was on a long sheet. And then I started moving around the hospital, and I saw on a shelf outside a window on one of the upper floors a blue men's tennis shoe that had scuff marks on it, and its shoelace was wrapped underneath it. Go find it." And she was so insistent that the hospital worker tried to go find it. She started going around upper floors of the hospital, looking on the ledges outside the windows for the shoe, and she found it. And she was able to retrieve the shoe and brought it back down to Maria and showed her, "Yes, your experience was real. I really found this." And this shoe could not have been seen from an ordinary perspective. It couldn't have been seen from outside, and Maria was brought into the hospital unconscious anyway. So one way or another, we have Maria acquiring information that she didn't know before her near-death experience, but it turned out to be true. And it goes beyond random chance, because if you're in most hospitals, they're not going to have a blue men's tennis shoe with scuff marks and a shoelace wrapped underneath it on an outside ledge. So this is beyond random chance information. And even if you want to say, as a materialist, that all this is due to brain phenomena, at least you have to say something paranormal is happening, because this, at a minimum, would display psychic information. If you're not a materialist, you may say, well, okay, maybe it's not just a psychic experience. Maybe it's an indication of consciousness really does survive the death of the body, and there is an afterlife. So that would be one example of veridical information. There are others. In fact, there's a whole category of what are known in parapsychology as peak-in-Darien experiences. That's P-E-A-K, like a mountain peak. And the term comes from an old poem about some Spanish explorers who ascend to the top of a peak in Darien province, Panama, and suddenly, unexpectedly, see the Pacific Ocean in front of them. And so a peak in Darien experience is one where you're either on your deathbed or you've actually died, and you see someone you didn't know was dead welcoming you into the afterlife. So you could be on your deathbed, or you could have actually had a near-death experience, and in the experience, you see your relatives coming to greet you and welcome you into the afterlife, and you see your grandmother and your grandfather and your mom, and here's your baby sister. And it's like, and you come back, and it's like, I saw my grandmom and my granddad and my mom and my baby sister, but she's not dead. And then they say, yeah, actually she is, and we didn't want to tell you. And there have been multiple peak-in-Darien experiences where people have come back from a near-death experience knowing about the death of someone they hadn't previously known was dead.
Those are some really surprising cases. So I just want to kind of put it to you. How much apologetical value, how strong of evidence do you think we can gain from these experiences for the existence of life after death?
Well, I think it's going to depend on how you rank the evidence. Is going to depend on the presumptions you make. If you are a hardcore materialist, you're going to dismiss all this and say it doesn't prove an afterlife. But if you're open on that question, if you aren't already committed to there not being an afterlife, and you're willing to look at the experience as it presents itself, which I think is essential to not being a paranoid person. We need to adopt a principle that in philosophy is sometimes called phenomenal conservatism, where you assume an experience is as it presents itself until you get evidence that it should be taken in some other way. Then you're going to look at these experiences and say they look like afterlife experiences. People are having conscious experiences when their brain is offline because it's not having any blood flow, and because the heart has stopped. And so, there's no way there's no plausible way these are being generated by the brain that would suggest that people really are conscious in an afterlife situation. Personally, I think there's strong evidence here. In fact, I'm currently scheduled to write a book. I'm doing the research for it now, but I'm scheduled to write a book that's going to be a general apology for the Christian faith, a defense of the Christian faith. Here's why you ought to be Christian, and also here's why you ought to be Catholic. But on the general level, I'm going to start the book with a chapter about near-death experiences. I'm going to start with Maria's story. It's 1977. A woman is dying. Here's what she experiences. It'll be a nice dramatic opening to the book. And then I'm going to talk about other near-death experiences too, including negative ones, and say, okay, we have evidence. This is scientific evidence. We have evidence now from that there is an afterlife and that people can have positive or negative experiences in it. That means we ought to take the subject of religion seriously. So read the rest of my book, and that'll be a nice intro to the whole book.
Well, you're getting into these negative experiences. How common are those? What % of these experiences are negative experiences?
We're not sure yet, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons is initially near-death experience researchers didn't really want to hear about these, and so they didn't ask about them. And even today, they wanted the nice, happy, popular stories you can report and everyone feels great, and you can even get press coverage on them. That's the kind of sexy story you want. And they didn't really want to find out about people reporting hell. And even today, they want to be sensitive to the near-death experiencers, and they don't want to say, so by any chance, did you happen to go to hell? Because if the person did, that could be a very traumatic issue to raise. And so they tend not to ask about them as much. And the people who've had them don't want to talk about them very much. You hear all these stories about other people going to heaven, and it's so blissful and it's so great. And it's like, I went to hell. Do I really want to tell people about that? And so you have a lot of negative near-death experiencers, or they're also called distressing near-death experiences, or DNDEs. The DNDEers frequently don't want to talk about it and will hide it and not communicate about it to people, and in particular not communicate about it to researchers. So whatever the correct number is, it's probably underreported. In terms of what we do know, there have been different studies. Some studies have shown no negative experiences, but we know that's wrong because there are negative ones that get reported. It's just that study didn't find them. Possibly because the researchers weren't asking, possibly because the distressed NDEers weren't talking. But there are other studies of large numbers of people that have indicated somewhere between about a sixth, 1 in 6, and 1 in 4 people who have an NDE have one with distressing aspects. And so you could average that 1 in 6 and 1 in 4 and say, okay, maybe 1 in 5, about 20% is a probable baseline for how many NDEs are negative and it's probably higher than that because of the underreporting. But 1 in 5 is a good baseline estimate.
So if they really are experiencing hell, are these 20% of people, are they just the worst of the worst sort of people? Who tends to experience these negative NDEs?
Well, if you read a lot of accounts, they'll say these can happen to anybody. And it doesn't seem that they happen to particularly bad people. But I think that that's misleading because I'm quite sure that when near-death experience researchers are talking to people who've had negative NDEs, they're not going to say, so, do you have a problem with pride or lust or anger, or are you a particularly bad person? You know, they're not going to, they're happy the person's even talking about their negative NDE. They're not going to be asking accusatory questions, doing a moral inventory on the person. And so I think they're just not collecting data. Also, we can't really know ever in this life the state of another person's heart. So, you know, there's no real way to judge a lot of that. One of the findings, though, that has borne out is that distressing near-death experiences are associated with suicide. According to one study by a researcher named Barbara Romer, in her sample, she found 30% of people who had distressing NDEs had attempted to kill themselves. And the world suicide rate is like 1.3%. So 1% of the global population tries to kill itself, but 30% of negative NDEs tried to kill themselves. That would suggest a strong correlation between suicide attempts and negative NDEs. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody who tries suicide has a negative NDE. There are accounts of people who didn't. And that's consistent with the fact that even if you try to kill yourself, you may not be responsible for your actions. You know, you may be under severe psychological pressure or something like that leads to the suicide, and you're not fully responsible for it. So you could have a positive NDE if you weren't responsible for your actions. But there does seem to be an association between suicide and negative near-death experiences.
Are there some commonalities in these negative NDEs? And are there different types or typologies?
Yeah, researchers have divided them into either 3 or 4 different kinds. And sometimes they're given numbers like type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. Type 1 experiences are also known as inverse experiences. And in an inverse negative NDE, it's essentially the same elements as in a positive NDE, only they're perceived differently emotionally. So instead of getting out of your body and feeling happy and free and zooming towards light and meeting loved ones, it's like you're flung out of your body and it's terrifying and you're zooming through this horrible tunnel and you're meeting strange beings that you don't know what they are. And so it's essentially the same experiences. They're just perceived in an emotionally negative way rather than an emotionally positive way. So that's type 1 or inverse NDEs. The next type 2 is what are known as void experiences. And in a void experience, it may start the same. You may leave your body, you may go through a tunnel or something, but then you end up in a place where you feel alone and you feel scared and you maybe encounter beings that are mocking you or things like that, but you feel very alone and isolated. There's a researcher, in fact, named Nancy Bush, who has written one of the key books on this. It's called Dancing Past the Dark. And she actually had a negative NDE that was a type 2. She was in the hospital. She was pregnant at the time, and she left her body and perceived herself as flying through space towards God or something in the distance. You know, she had the sense, I'm moving towards God, I guess. And then it kind of stalled, and she saw these circles, like about 6 circles approaching her. And she didn't know what they were. Later, after she was revived, in some years later, I understand, she saw the yin-yang symbol, and she said, that's what I saw in my near-death experience. She saw like half a dozen yin-yang symbols approaching her, and they were flashing. You know how they've got a light side and a dark side? They were flashing between light and dark. So like positive image, negative image, positive image, negative image. And she could tell by the way they were flashing, they're mocking her and telling her, you don't exist. Your life never existed. Your husband never existed. Your babies never existed. Nothing ever existed. It was all a game. It was all a joke. And so she encountered these mocking entities in her type 2 void experience, and she felt very alone in the void before she got brought back. Type 3 experiences are also called hellish experiences, and these are the ones where someone perceives something that they understand to be hell. For example, one woman perceived sliding down like a long ramp or something and arriving at a cave that was covered with cobwebs, and she could hear sounds of moaning and suffering. Another gentleman thought he fell down a flight of stairs and arrived at a couple of rusty iron gates, and there were benches outside the gates on which suffering people were sitting. And they perceived another woman just woke up and told her daughter, I've seen Dante's Inferno. Which to me is just, because of its brevity, that has the most punch. You know, I've seen Dante's Inferno, and that's all they want to say. So those would be hellish experiences. The fourth type is only used by some researchers. Barbara Romer uses it, but Nancy Bush doesn't. And it's called the negative judgment experience. And essentially, I would kind of look at it and say this is a variation of type 1. Because in type 1, you have the normal elements, but they're perceived emotionally negatively. Well, one of the normal elements is the life review, where you get to review everything you did in your life. Well, in a type 4 negative judgment experience, you essentially get to the life review and it goes badly for you. You feel like you're being judged by the higher power. It's not just that you're feeling the pain you caused others, but it's in a context of love. It's you're feeling the pain you caused others, and it's not in a context of love. So that's type 4. And then there are also some experiences that are called hybrid experiences that combine elements of more than one type. My favorite example of this is from a Jewish woman named Rachel, who was in a car crash, and she left her body. She surveyed the scene of the car crash and saw her children, she had 2 boys at the time, had been taken by a woman to another car. She saw one of the women in the car crash had died, and her own body was trapped in her own car. And then she's Jewish, so she believes in God. She doesn't believe in Jesus, but she meets this Jesus-like figure. And he's like Jesus is portrayed in art, and he's just radiating peace and warmth and love, and she takes him by the hand, and she just wants to stay with him forever. And he takes her so this is the positive part of the experience. He then takes her to a well, and on one side of the well, there are all of these people who are like chained and suffering and skeletal. And she understands that if she stays, even though she wants to stay and be with this Jesus figure, she's going to become like one of these other people who's chained. And then she finds out why, because he and there are like snakes on the ground, and she's walking over those and stuff. And the Jesus figure takes her to the well, and she looks into the well, and she sees her children, only they're older. Her 2 boys are older, and she's got a daughter now, and which she doesn't have at the moment. And the children are crying out, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, please come back to us. We need you." And she understands that if she stays, which is what she wants to do, she'll be abandoning her children, and she needs to go back and take care of them. So she had this negative experience of seeing all of the apparently damned people as a kind of warning to, you really need to go back and take care of these kids. And in later years, she did have a daughter who looked just like the one she saw in the vision. So, so that was a hybrid experience that included both positive and negative elements.
So I've read quite a few works on near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one of those topics that I really sort of gravitate towards, trying to get an opinion. And I've kind of noticed something that your research has really brought out, which is they really don't talk about these a lot.
Yeah.
When I listen to your podcast, some of these are the first time I've ever heard of these experiences, these negative experiences. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's for the reasons we mentioned. Negative near-death experiencers don't want to talk about them. And NDE researchers don't want to ask about them, and in the past, frankly, did not want to hear about them. But that is changing, and so there are books out now exclusively devoted to negative NDEs, like Barbara Romer's book "Blessing in Disguise" and Nancy Bush's book "Dancing Past the Dark." There are also chapters now that are being written. Bruce Grayson's Handbook of Near-Death Experiences now has a chapter on the negative ones, and the International Association for Near-Death Studies webpage now has a webpage devoted to negative experiences. So there's becoming much more awareness of them, but if you read older literature, you won't find as much. And even now, it's still percolating out there. I've taken classes in parapsychology where I've been told, oh yeah, there are negative ones, but they're very rare. It's like, no, 20% is not very rare. So it's still kind of percolating out there in terms of consciousness, in terms of the consciousness of the research community.
So, I mean, the immediate Christian response to these negative NDEs is probably to think, oh, they're experiencing actual hell or actual judgment. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that conclusion?
Well, I think they can be, but I think we need to be cautious in how we proceed rather than just leaping to that conclusion, because there are other possibilities. For example, if we look at out-of-body experiences, which are not near-death experiences, but where someone's perspective suddenly shifts to where they don't seem to be inside their body anymore. These are commonly known. They can actually be induced, and they do retrieve veridical information at times, and they've been well studied. But sometimes there are spontaneous. Now, if you're a practiced out-of-body experiencer, and you can shift your perspective outside of your body, you're not that likely to freak out. But there are also spontaneous out-of-body experiences that frequently occur in traumatic situations. For example, I know a gentleman and a researcher named Dale Graff, and back in, I think it was the 1960s, Dale and his family were at the beach, and his wife did not swim. And somehow she got out into the water and was carried away by the current. And he was surfing, and he's out there. He's exhausted from the surfing and about ready to come in. And all of a sudden, his wife is out here in the water with him, and she doesn't know how to swim. And the waves were sufficiently harsh that it became a very dangerous situation. And all of a sudden, Dale is out of his body and has a bird's eye view so he can see where his wife is and heads toward her, and he was able to save her life. But when someone is in this kind of traumatic experience and suddenly unexpectedly they find themselves out of their body, they can freak out because they're in this scary situation and they carry that scariness with them into the out-of-body experience. Well, if that happens with out-of-body experiences in general, you could imagine the same thing happening with the out-of-body experiences that occur in NDEs. And so if let's say you're a young person, you're 17, you're a male, you're reckless, you're having fun, all of a sudden you're in an auto accident and you're out of your body, you might freak out. And thus that fear that you carry with you might color your experience of the NDE. And so if you had died peacefully in a hospital, you might experience peace and joy and bliss. But you're dying in the middle of this adrenaline moment at a time of life you're not expecting to die. You may be going, no, I want to go back. And that may lead you to have a type 1 experience where it's all the same stuff. You're just reacting to it emotionally in a different way. So I think that's one of the considerations that we need to have here. We're not, people might have the idea that the instant you die, you're just in total bliss, and that's a rule for everybody. Well, that would be cool. But, the Bible doesn't say that's what's going to happen. And the church fathers don't say that's what's going to happen. And authoritative church teaching doesn't say that's what's going to happen. That would be just an assumption on our part. And we need to check our assumptions by looking at what do people's actual experiences say. And so I wouldn't assume that if you're saved, the minute you're out of your body, you're instantly going to be in bliss. If you were otherwise freaking out at that moment, it might take you a little while to calm down and accept the new situation. And that is what's reported in these experiences. And there are negative NDEs that are reported that are hybrid ones, where it starts negative, but then as the person relaxes, it becomes positive. So I think that's a possibility. Also, in the suicide cases, now there are suicide cases where someone said, I tried to kill myself and I instantly was in a bad place and realized I'd made a horrible mistake and wished I hadn't done it. And I got this sense I was going to be suffering for a long time because of what I did. But there also may be an emotional overhang from the suicide attempt. If you're so tormented that you want to end it and you kill yourself, you may be just as tormented on the other side, and you may not instantly be relieved of that. And so even if the person's gonna end up in heaven, they may have some negative carryover from how they ended their own life, just in terms of, I was tortured on earth and you're still kind of tortured in the afterlife until you can emotionally heal, which leads to another possibility: purgatory. Just because now in the Protestant vision, it's commonly understood that heaven and hell are the only two experiences that people will have in the afterlife. But in the historic Jewish understanding, and in the more historic versions of Christianity, like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy, it's understood that there can be purificatory experiences in the afterlife that are not necessarily all fun, but they're part of a growth process that allows us to be the kind of spiritually unencumbered beings we need to be in order to enjoy the full glory of heaven. And there have even been Protestants who have shared this view. C.S. Lewis would be an example. And I think even if it's, even if you want to say purgatory or the final purification is instantaneous and painless, I think most of us could agree as Christians that there's got to be something that you could reasonably call purgatory, because it's clear from Christian experience, most of us are not perfect at the moment of our death, but we are going to be perfect in heaven. So between the moment of death and the moment of heaven, we have to be purified of our remaining imperfections. And that purification process begins in this life as sanctification, but we're not perfectly sanctified at the moment of death. So you could conceive of purgatory as sort of the final stage or final rush of sanctification. You could say it happens instantly and painlessly. That's fine, but we could agree it's there. And if it's there, then since we're not told it's painless, Scripture doesn't say that, it could involve some discomfort, of letting go of the various things that we've been unduly attached to in this life, which is actually the Catholic Church's current articulation of what purgatory is. It heals us of our disordered desires so that we're not burdened by disordered desires in heaven. And so let's say you killed yourself. And let's say you weren't ultimately responsible, but maybe you were partly responsible. And maybe you need to work through some of those issues that led you to kill yourself. Well, that would be part of your purification process. And so from this somewhat non-doctrinaire perspective, I would say that some of these experiences may be purgatorial rather than actual hell. So I think there's a range of possibilities in addition to hell. Now, in these cases, all of the people came back. So none of them were finally sentenced to hell. But they may have been allowed to glimpse hell to show them what their fate would be if you died the way you are right now. And so I don't dismiss hell as being one of the things people are experiencing, but I don't think it's the automatic thing that's responsible for any negative elements. I think things like emotional adjustment reactions and surprise can be one of them. I think emotions you're carrying into the afterlife with you, like in the case of a tormented person who kills themselves, it could be carryover emotions. It could be part of your purification, or it could be hell.
Kind of on that note, one last little tidbit is in our conversation, you talked about some topics that you're going to be talking about in the future. Maybe you could throw some of those out there to pique our listeners' curiosity.
Well, so I'm not exactly sure when this episode is going to release, but on the Friday we're recording it, I have a new episode every Friday. And on the Friday we're recording this, I have an episode on one of the most pivotal poltergeist cases in the history of parapsychology. It took place in the 1950s in New York, in Seaford, Long Island. There was a family there that started having objects moving around in their house. They'd get knocked over, they'd get smashed, and a lot of what was happening was bottle caps coming off. The bottle cap would just pop off, and sometimes the liquid in the bottle would spill, or the bottle would lift up and get smashed. But over and over and over, bottle caps are coming off, and many of these bottle caps were screw-on caps, so they couldn't just pop off like from pressure. They had to be unscrewed. And so this was poltergeist phenomena, and because of all the bottle caps popping off, it became known as the Popper poltergeist case, also known as the Seaford case. And it was important in the history of parapsychology because parapsychologists found out about it quickly, and they were able to come in and investigate the phenomena while it was still happening, and eliminate various natural explanations for it. And it also allowed them to test a new theory that they had been developing. The term poltergeist is German for noisy ghost or rattling spirit. And people have always assumed poltergeist activity is due to ghosts or spirits. But in the early 20th century, parapsychologists started to think this may not be a spirit. This may be something that living people are doing without realizing it. And so they developed a theory that's now known as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. And the Popper poltergeist case allowed them to compare an actual poltergeist experience to that theory and see how it stood up. And so that's what I have in this week's Mysterious World. I also have a proposal that I've never seen in print before for why the bottle caps were so prominent in this case. I think there's a reason why so many bottles were losing their tops in this particular poltergeist case. Coming up next week, I have an episode on the Gospel of Jesus's Wife, which was it's actually a tiny little credit card sized document, but it's written on ancient papyrus, and it was touted a few years ago, just, like 10 years ago or something, as a 2nd century gospel that talked about Jesus having a wife. And so I look into that, I look into how credible it is, and I expose who the forger was. The week after that, we're going to be looking at 18th century France and we're going to be on a cryptid hunt. We're going to be talking about the Beast of Gévaudan, which killed like 100 people in France. And we're going to be talking about what this beast was and looking at the evidence concerning that. Then the week after that, as a palate cleanser for me having to read all those bloody accounts of what the beast did, we're going to have a happy story involving animals. We're going to be looking at pet telepathy. And there have been scientific studies of pets and whether they sometimes seem to display telepathic abilities, like being able to anticipate when their owners are about to return home even though they have no signal that would tell them their owner is returning home. We're also going to be playing footage of a telepathy experiment with a parrot that can talk. And so you've got the parrot in one room. We'll be watching this on split screen. You're going to have the parrot in one room, the owner of the parrot that it's bonded with in a completely different room on a different floor of the house, looking at photos. Her job is to open an envelope, look at a photo for 2 minutes, then a timer rings, she opens the next envelope and looks at it. And they simultaneously record what the parrot is saying. So when the woman is looking at a photo of a flower, you hear the parrot saying, "That's a pic of flower. Flower, got to get some flower. Take a camera, get a pic of flower." And then when the woman is looking at a photograph of a guy talking on the phone, the parrot starts making noises like an answering machine and then says, "What you doing on the phone?" And when she looks at a picture of a cab driver sticking his head out of his cab to give directions to a guy, you see the parrot saying, "Oh, that's so cool. You stuck your head out. You stuck your head out." And when she's looking at a picture of a couple walking along a beach in bathing suits, so they're showing a lot of skin, the parrot says, "Look at my pretty naked body. Look at my pretty naked body." And so that will be interesting to show the audience that kind of stuff. And finally, last week in February, we're going to be talking about the chronovisor, an alleged device that the Vatican supposedly knows about and or has that would let you view any point in space and time. It's basically a time television. And there was a famous monk in Italy who claimed, and exorcist, he was a famous exorcist, who claimed to have worked on it. So we're going to be telling you all about the chronovisor. So those are a few things coming up.
That is really exciting. And you might have thought you were just pitching your podcast, but ours as well. Mm-hmm. Go back and check out our animal telepathy episode where we interview Rupert Sheldrake. I think those will go well together.
Yeah, indeed.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially subscribing to this channel. I'm trying to grow it, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless.